we're going to have something, again, different, but again, combining sleep and art broadly. I really wanted to have the representation of literature, and to be absolutely honest, I invited Salley Vickers because I've read her books and really like them. I'm sure I should say something more grown up and scientific than that, but some of the descriptions of some of her literary protagonists and how they were on occasions tortured by poor sleep, and some of the description of the dreams did make me think that maybe she'd had some clinical training or some clinical contact with patients, although she could have just had a fantastically good imagination, of course. But when I asked her to talk, she said she was happy to come, which I'm very grateful about, because, in fact, she does have another life as someone who did think about and explore patient psychology. And thank you very much again for coming to talk to us. Thank you.
Can you see that? It's a bit murky.
Do you want the lights down? Or
I think down a bit, although I have to read this. Yeah, that's better. I'm going to talk mainly about dreams. And I'm a writer now. I've given up being a psychoanalyst insofar as you can ever give it up. So I'm looking at the way dreams get presented in literature, which both Freud and Jung, who really brought the whole business of dreaming into the scientific world, always acknowledged was in many ways understood as well or better by the poets and writers that went before them. Freud in particular had a great respect for the ancients, both in art and in literature. So I'm going to start with the Odyssey, where we have a very interesting account of what the ancients thought dreaming was about. Towards the end of the Odyssey, Penelope, who, during the lengthy absence of her wandering husband, has successfully held off the marauding suitors who want to take over both her and the kingdom of Ithaca, applies a series of tests to the returned Odysseus by recounting to him a dream. The dream she recounts is of an eagle killing off the geese in her yard. And as she grieves in the dream, quite an unusual thing actually to be doing in a dream, as she grieves in the dream for the lost geese, the eagle returns and, perching on a rafter, speaks to her, and this is a rather clumsy translation, but it was the best I could find. "Be of good courage," said the eagle, daughter of Icarus. "This is no dream, but a vision of good omen that shall surely come to pass. The geese are the suitors, and I am no longer an eagle, but your own husband, who has come back to you and will bring these suitors to a devastating end." At this I woke, and when I looked out, I saw my geese at the trough eating their mash as usual. "This dream, madam," replied Odysseus, "can admit of but one interpretation. For has not Odysseus himself told you how it shall be fulfilled? The death of the suitors is portended, and not single one of them will escape." And wise Penelope answered, "Stranger, dreams are very curious and unaccountable things, and they do not by any means invariably come true. There are two gates through which these unsubstantial fancies proceed. The one is of horn, and the other ivory. Those that come through the gate of ivory are fanciful, but those from the gate of horn mean something to those that see them. I do not think, however, that my own dream came through the gate of horn, though I and my son would be most thankful if it proves to have done so." Now, setting aside for the moment the fact that Penelope's geese are actually very dear to her, while the suitors are actually a pesky nuisance, which has made me wonder how much Penelope really wants to be rid of them. I mean, her husband has been away an awfully long time. What I want to remark on here is this ancient idea of a binary notion of two kinds of dream. According to the ancient commentaries, which we do have, they arise out of a distinction between eye and mouth. Horn, rather interestingly, was associated with the fine film that protects the eye, while ivory is a metaphor for teeth, from which we can infer that what is seen or envisaged had a truer validity for the Greeks than the spoken word. Indeed, for them, great rhetoricians as they became, the spoken word is more than simply artful. It's the medium of deception and lies. Now, you might see this as a kind of presage of Freud's early distinction between the dreams of infantile wish fulfillment and the altogether more complex dreams, which reflect aspects of life perceived not by the conscious mind, but by our more reflective unconscious, which mirrors in dream form the as yet unknown because to the dreamer distasteful. Freud's ruling anxiety became, for his own psychological reasons, that psychoanalysis should be regarded as the final triumph of the so-called rational mind, which led to his theory that we can speak meaningfully of what our nighttime vision perceives. This was not the view of the ancient Greco-Roman world, which is something he never really grasped, for which vision always had the stronger element, which is preserved in the word's etymology, of visionary. Which is why, for the ancients, dreams are also the medium of prophecy. Theirs was a world in which the boundaries between individual and universe were much more fluid, so that the as yet undisclosed aspects of the personal self are readily equated with the as yet undisclosed aspects of linear time. So what's going to happen to the individual and what's going to happen to the universe are much more closely linked. Virgil, writing later, Roman, famously borrowed the image of the horn and ivory gates for the Aeneid, his own take on the Homeric epic. At the end of Book 6, when Aeneas has descended into the underworld, accompanied by the Sibyl, to meet his dead father, Anchises, we are told, there are two gates of sleep. One is called the Gate of Horn, and it is an easy exit for true shades. The other is made all in gleaming white ivory, but through it the powers of the underworld send false dreams up to heaven. Here in the night, Anchises walked with his son and with the Sibyl, and spoke these words to them as he sent them on their journey through the Gate of Ivory. And this is Aeneas coming out from the underworld, going through the Gate of Ivory. Virgil turns Homer's picture about so that the focus now is less on the quality of the dream material received through the opposing gates, but the dreamer's connection to an ambiguous underworld. Sleep here is a kind of existential no man's land into which pass true or false shades from an immortal other country while making their passage into our quotidian waking world. Interestingly, Aeneas and the accompanying Sibyl take the ivory exit, which classes them among the false shades. This has given rise to quite a lot of scholarly puzzlement, but I suggest that Aeneas is obliged to exit the false gate, not because he's intentionally a deceiver, but because he's not yet undergone the necessary refining process, the dissolution of the physical self, which would qualify him to be an authentic harbinger of the amorphous and necessarily immortal underworld. Here, as is implied in Homer, we have a conflation of the underworld as the sort of retirement home of the past, the dead who have once been living and have since left life, but at one and the same time, the kingdom of the heralds of what is to come. Aeneas, still in the state of is rather than has been, is afflicted with the usual human susceptibility to partiality and error. It's of a piece with the Greco-Roman ironical view of mortal life, and a corollary of the immortal sardonic, long-sighted perspective on humankind that only those initiated out of life into a state of non-being can truly know. Hence the famous choric cry, "Count no man happy until he is dead." Only a true shade of the past can make manifest what will be, which, if you want to go Freudian on this, though to my mind the ancient images do it better, precisely or imprecisely, because they don't have to spell it out, only by encounter with the reality of what has been is there any possibility of any authentic growth to the future. The reality principle, as dramatized by Virgil, plays rather better in my eyes. For me, it's the compounding of time, not as linear, but as a kind of Mobius strip that is most telling in this ancient perspective. In Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pearce, perhaps my favourite children's book, dreams are key and time is the medium. It's the story, in fact, which first got me hooked on the enigma of time. And I write about this quite a bit in my own books. It was really the sort of seed of them. Tom is a 10-year-old boy banished from his home because his brother has measles. The book is set in the 50s, when measles could still kill or permanently maim, so that quarantine for children was not unusual. Tom and his brother have planned to make a tree house over the holidays, and it is this loss which makes Tom especially resentful of the banishment. He is sent to stay with a kindly but childless uncle and aunt, who are rather heavy-handed in their nurture and their sympathy. They live in a poky flat in a large Edwardian house, and it's a house, they assure him with regret, without a garden. One night, awake and suffering indigestion from the rich food his aunt has plied him with, Tom hears the grandfather clock, which stands in the downstairs hallway, strike 13. He creeps down in his pyjamas to investigate, and seeing light coming through the back door, opens it to find himself in broad daylight in a huge and wondrous garden. He's at first convinced his uncle and aunt have conspired to dupe him and are wantonly concealing the garden from him. But further investigation proves that by daylight, the midnight garden is only a scruffy backyard. The story unfolds as he goes nightly to the garden, where he meets and befriends a girl called Hattie, who alone among the other occupants of the household can see him. But he has no corporeal substance in this world. Hattie can pass her hands through him more easily as time elapses, and there are odd variations in her age. Time is clearly not linear in this garden, and indeed, reading the face of the grandfather clock one day, Tom finds a speaking text from the book of Revelation. There shall be time no longer. Dreams are our escape from linear time. And in this story, Philippa Pearce does something so clever with this suggestion that following it still foxes my rational brain. Tom has been warned to be wary of the old lady who owns the house and is especially possessive of the grandfather clock, which he ritually winds each evening. At the very end of the book, we discover that the seemingly fearsome old lady is Hattie, who has been dreaming of her childhood, and Tom, it seems, has entered her past via the portal of her dreams, so that the boy who was not yet born remains a crucial and treasured part of her childhood experience. It is relevant that once she begins to move into adulthood, he begins to fade, until he no longer appears to her in time past, but can only meet in time present. There are even material proofs of his presence in Hattie's history, a time before he was even conceived, in the form of a pair of ice skates that he asks Hattie to hide under the floorboard of the nursery, which in real time, or I should say with respect to the book, current time, is now the room in which Tom is sleeping, and where he indeed finds the hidden skates. This is a story about time and how consciousness can move about within it, not in the Freudian sense, but a sense that I'm tempted to call mystical, because it suggests that we are not limited by the peculiar timeline on which we are born, but can move through some trick of consciousness into other timelines, which is what imagination, of course, in a weaker sense, also can do for us. Philippa Pearce doesn't explain what it is that has enabled this Mobius strip, which connects not only two historical ages, but two individual consciousnesses, but it's surely relevant that the text that lies at the heart of the story comes from a book of revelation. A dream is a form of revelation. It reveals what has been hidden, but what it must in some sense remain hidden, because its proper home will always be in the dark. In Orwell's 1984, Winston Smith dreams that O'Brien, who will torture and break him ultimately, says to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." As a rule, I have to say I encounter dreams in novels with a sinking heart. And I say this as someone who writes as well as read novels. I accept much of poetry and drama from this prejudice, which I think has something to do with their very different forms. A dream in a novel is almost always a sign that the writer has given up, was merely taking an idle break and using a load of symbolism to do the hard work. Dreams in fiction very rarely trigger the necessary suspension of disbelief. And I think this does have something to do with that shrewd ancient distinction between the mouth and words, the ivory gate, and the eye and images, the gate of horn. But for reasons I don't completely understand, this prejudice of mine doesn't extend to children's fiction, as I've already shown you with talking about Thomas Midnight Garden. And I think perhaps because a child's conscious self is closer to the place that we nowadays call the unconscious, which the ancients more or less called the underworld, and the romantics sometimes like to locate as heaven. I'm thinking of trailing clouds of glory, do we come from God who is in our home, heaven lies about us in our infancy, Wordsworth. So dreams seem more at home in children's stories. The time-honoured fictional diet for children, fairy tales, by which I don't mean the faux Hans Andersen moral travesties, are very like dreams, which is to say that they are raggedy and unstructured in form and have just that often brutal brevity and inconsequential quality of the authentic dream. We don't balk at the sudden shifts in locus, in attitude, in fortune, in a fairy tale. We don't, for example, say, why doesn't the Queen wait to talk to the King in person and simply obey the instructions of a bogus letter? We're familiar, if not always comfortable, with such quirks of plot, because we've been made accustomed to them by the patterns of our own dreams. In a real fairy tale, good and bad are not moral opposites, but alternative routes or possibilities, partings in the road, where how you choose direction depends on the seeming insignificant detail manifested in a blade of grass, a dropped feather, or the beady eye of a passing field mouse. The survivors in fairy tales do not align themselves with the prevailing moral climate. If they have discernible virtues, they are the virtue of persistence and the quality of kindness, not so much in its current sense of charity, as the recognition of kinship with all elements of life, however insignificant, weird, or unsavory. Nor do they think or act in terms of deserts, just or otherwise, but take possibilities pragmatically, often leaving the fateful choice to that austere divinity, luck, which, like all divinities, tends to favour its faithful disciples. Luck only works when you resign yourself to it and concede that you may not know best. The analyst Wilfred Bion said of dreams that one should not ask what a dream was about, but where the dreamer had gone. For him, a dream was a journey, one taken without a map. It can't have, because the journey must be uncharted and it must be unique to the dreamer. And the direction the journey took had outcomes rather than consequences, from which it follows that what you learned, in the sense of accumulating knowledge, wasn't what was important. What was important was the altogether novel experience. An experience could only be had in that particular dream. Lewis Carroll's two great children's classics, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, and What Alice Found There, brilliantly exemplify this philosophy of the picaresque. Alice is not a particularly likeable child. She's no milk and honey Victorian ideal, and though mostly polite, she's also quick to argue, and occasionally even cruel. Both in the everyday world she sets out from and in the Wonderland and Looking Glass dream worlds in which she travels, she exudes a vitality which borders on the savage. Once she had really frightened her old nurse by shouting suddenly in her ear, "Nurse, do let's pretend that I'm a hungry hyena and you're a bone." And remember how, turned giantess by the magic mushroom, she boots poor little Bill the lizard up and out of the chimney, feeling no compunction whatsoever when he has to be revived with smelling salts. And how disappointed the mild-mannered White Knight is at her response to his recitation of the aged man. And now if e'er by chance I put my fingers into glue, or madly squeeze a right-hand foot into a left-hand shoe, or if I drop upon my toe a very heavy weight, I weep, for it reminds me so of that old man I used to know, whose look was mild, whose speech was slow, whose hair was whiter than the snow, whose face was very like a crow, with eyes like cinders all aglow, who seemed distracted with his woe, who rocked his body to and fro and muttered mumblingly and low, as if his mouth were full of dough, who snorted like a buffalo that summer evening long ago, a-sitting on a gate. I liked it very much, Alice says at this conclusion. I hope so, the knight said doubtfully, but you didn't cry as much as I expected. I cannot now recollect how I responded to these mournful verses when I read them as a child, although I was eager to learn them by heart. But now, while I do find them amusing, they also evoke in me a strange sense of sadness. But no tears come to Alice's eyes. She finds the verses, as we may with her, funny and quaint, but she hasn't learned yet to weep at others' misfortunes. Unlike Hopkins' Margaret, she doesn't grieve for the plight man is born for. And in her creator's eyes, this is just as it should be. The title tells us she is in the looking glass world to look, to see what she might find there. Alice, although she doesn't know it, has a chessboard to cross, and she will make the crossing successfully because the characters, and they are a diverse bunch she meets on the way, interest and amuse her, and she engages with them as opportunities for entertaining dialogue, rather than treating them as portents and signs or occasions for embarrassment and guilt. Although she is a stranger, she is not estranged, and her encounters with this rum crowd free her rather than distrain her. I shall sit here, says the frog footman, on and off for days and days. But what am I to do? Said Alice. And here comes the book's superb answer. Anything you like, said the footman, and began whistling. Now, I'm into a prejudice over dreams in adult fiction, but as always, there are exceptions. And one honourable exception is Anna Karenina's dream. Anna Karenina, the heroine of Tolstoy's novel, who leaves her husband and runs away with her lover Vronsky, thus cutting herself off forever from polite society. She has a nightmare in which she enters a room to find an ugly peasant hunched in the corner, working on an unidentified piece of metal. and muttering some indistinguishable words in French. The waking Anna instinctively interprets the ugly peasant as a harbinger of her own death and is at once consumed by a stupefying fear. Later, while she's sitting on the train that is about, although she's unaware of this, to transport her to the actual scene of her death, a misshapen-looking peasant covered with dirt, in a cap from which his tangled hair stuck out all round, passed by the window, stooping down to the carriage wheels. There's something familiar about that hideous peasant, thought Anna, and remembering her dream, she moved away to the opposite door, shaking with terror. She alights at the next station for no clear reason, and walking to the end of the platform, she stopped. Some ladies paused in their loud laughter and talking and stared at her as she reached them. She quickened her pace and walked away from them to the edge of the platform. A luggage train was coming in. The platform began to sway, and she fancied she was in the train again. And all at once, she thought of the man crushed by the train, the day she had first met Vronsky, and she knew what she had to do. With a rapid, light step, she went down the steps that led from the tank to the rails and stopped quite near the approaching train. She looked at the lower part of the carriages, at the screws and chains and the tall cast-iron wheel of the first carriage, slowly moving up and down and trying to measure the middle between the front and back wheels, and the very minute when that middle point would be opposite her. There, she said to herself, looking into the shadow of the carriage, there in the very middle, I will punish him and escape from everyone and from myself. She tried to fling herself below the wheels of the first carriage as it reached her, but the red bag, which she tried to drop out of her hand, delayed her, and she was too late. She missed the moment. She had to wait for the next carriage. A feeling such as she had known when about to take the first plunge in bathing came upon her, and she crossed herself. That familiar gesture brought back into her soul a whole series of girlish and childish memories. Suddenly, the darkness that had covered everything for her was torn apart, and life rose up before her for an instant with all its bright past joys. But she did not take her eyes from the wheels of the second carriage, and exactly at the moment when the space between the wheels came opposite her, she dropped the red bag, and drawing her head back into her shoulders, fell on her hands under the carriage, and lightly, as though she would rise again at once, dropped onto her knees. And at the same instant, she was terror-stricken at what she was doing. Where am I? What am I doing? What for? She tried to get up, to drop backwards, but something huge and merciless struck her on the head, and rolled her over on her back. Lord, forgive me all, she said, feeling it impossible to struggle. A peasant, muttering something, was working at the iron above her. Now, I've tried several times to put my finger on why this dream and how Tolstoy plays it as he charts or creates Anna's destiny works for me. And I think it's because of its seeming formal autonomy. It's not explanatory. It tallies with nothing that we've come to recognize in Anna. She's not a peasant, nor has she had any truck with the peasantry, unlike her author or her co-protagonist Levin in the novel. Her French would be fluent, her skills at metalwork non-existent. Nor does she seem to be a negative reflection of what we know of her, which is actually only a different side of the same explanatory coin. And yet this hunched, muttering figure does ring true. He is the form, we sense, of something deep and primitive in Anna, some inalienable aspect, which against all the amassed resistance of her class, her education, the poignant claims of motherhood, and the oppressive social mores in which she's lived and moved and had her seeming being, has prompted the abandoning of her son, her passionate elopement with Vronsky, and will precipitate her death. If we want to be Freudian again, we might say that the peasant is the unreconstructed id, or more persuasively perhaps, the so-called death drive. If we want to be Jungian, we might see him as a shadow figure, the representation of all in herself that Anna has eschewed or denied. But the dream figure is so much more than this, with his muttered French and his mysterious ironwork. And while Anna takes him as a thing of darkness, one that she cannot or will not acknowledge hers, this is by no means inherent in the way Tolstoy presents the picture. If the ugly peasant chills us almost as much as he chills Anna, it is because his power, of which the bungling suicide is only the final evidence, eludes explanation. What he is not, as is too often, I'm afraid, the case in dream fiction, is a symbolic signpost directing us to some lofty metaphysical plane. He has no message. His being is the message. Some refractory irreducible, which on the one hand cannot be accounted for and yet cannot be eradicated. As sure as eggs, the hunched and hideous peasant has arrived through those Homeric gates of horn, incorporating what was, what is, and what will be in that spiral of the innate and the contingent, which has become Anna's life, and which finally acts as the whirlpool which destabilizes her and sucks her under. He is a prophetic shade, but he's only prophetic because he has come from an underworld that is Anna's own hinterland, a place of which she's unaware or has forgotten or chosen not to know, and which we only catch an oblique, if convincing, glimpse of through this dream. There is no backstory to Anna, no heartless or absent mother or authoritarian bullying father to take the rap as psychological causes. The meaning of the peasant is only identified when Anna elects to entertain him as her destiny. But destiny in Tolstoy is not determined, and hers, to the very last, remains ambiguous in its potential outcome. She might, Tolstoy intimates, as easily not have jumped. She at first hesitates on that platform, falls, and even as she does so, light blazes, and she wishes herself back. In an alternative nick of time, the dream and its physical counterpart, the misshapen railway worker who frightens her, might have made a different sense as a resource, something invincible, enabling her to stick it out and go on. Perhaps it is relevant that she has lost her son, because a child's naivety might, I think, respond to this figure differently. What I'm driving at is that the peasant has neither an inherent value nor an inherent meaning. He is, if not exactly a Rorschach blot, accruing meaning only as beheld by the beholder. He's more like a Schrödinger's cat, acquiring life or death according to the viewer's stance, or, to return to fairy tales, perhaps a fairy godmother in the being of an ugly old woman, waiting to take shape according to whether she's welcomed or repulsed. What Tolstoy understood was that dreams, like desire, cannot be commissioned, and therefore appear to us as if they were agents from another world. If they are oracles, they are always oracles in the Delphic sense, determined not by some objective fate, but by the peculiar cast of mind and disposition of the recipient. Now, I've left the best till last, which is Shakespeare. Does this? Yep. And if ever any writer had a feeling for dreams, it was him. I could rattle off any number of examples where dreams colour the whole fabric of the play. Taming of the Shrew, Merchant of Venice, Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, Henry V, Troilus and Cressida, Hamlet, Cleopatra, you name it. But I'm centering on this play, which announces itself as a dream, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and this is one of the many pictures of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and this one is by Landseer. I like the difference in proportions he gets there. Any play is already working with at least two realities: the everyday world of the audience and the other world of the play. In Shakespeare's plays, within the world of the play, we regularly have another world, an inner play, and we also regularly have a dream or dreams which play out in the world of the play and may even play out upon the world of the play within the play. Reality for Shakespeare was always multiple, and nothing could be more his hallmark than his exuberant delight in these recurring sets of Chinese box-like realities. And in A Midsummer Night's Dream, he has a ball. For here is a play which calls itself a dream, which has at its heart a wood full of magic, within which are enacted 3 very different plays, and it concludes with the play and finishes off with a speech about plays. For Shakespeare, dream and play and playing are intimately intertwined. There's a sort of sense in which I have tended to think of the 2 bookends of the play, the scene set in Athens, as the dream sequences, but this is to define dream with an un-Shakespearean barrenness. And what I think probably I have in mind with this thought is that the Athenian scenes, despite the presence of 2 richly mythological figures, Theseus and Hippolyta, feel thin by comparison with the rumbunctiously vivid goings-on in the wood. Not thin in the writing, but in the nature of the society and the intercourse we meet there. Britten, in his opera, excises these opening scenes, and if he includes the final scene, where we return to Athens, I think it's only because by this stage the fairy world has invaded the mortal world and brought a kind of restorative song and dance blessing to it. However you describe it, from the word go, the play has 3 realities. Ours, the audience's, sober, rational Athens, run on pretty rule-bound lines, and the anarchic wood, where the fairies don't so much rule as hold sway. And it's worth remembering that wood was an Elizabethanism for mad. The fairies, insofar as they hold sway, do so only at night, which naturally aligns them with sleep and dream. And as the denizens of the wood, they are aspects of the natural world, but engaged as they are in an energetic quarrel between Oberon and Titania, it's a nature which is divided. Into this dark place, where nature is at war, come 2 sets of would-be lovers, also themselves somewhat at war, and a group of hard-handed men of Athens who plan to put on a play at Duke Theseus' wedding. And will they, nill they, all find themselves unwitting actors in a series of plays, farces almost, directed and performed by the fairies. Now, why does this work? Why do we, who for the most part, I suspect, don't believe in fairies, find this striking chords in us? I actually doubt if Shakespeare or many of his contemporaries believed in fairies, or not in the way that children still believe, or apparently Arthur Conan Doyle still believed. But that's another story. But it doesn't follow from this that fairies had no reality for him. If they didn't, we wouldn't believe in his play. We'd merely indulge it, as we do when we take our children, for example, to Peter Pan. The fairies here are constellations of forces which have their way with us, and if we don't recognize them immediately, we are affected by them, as the play mortals are. The fairies have recognizable qualities which we share: sexual jealousy, cruelty, humor, a capacity for tenderness and sorrow, but at the same time they are not us, for they are not mortal. They inhabit a netherworld which coexists with the visible world and the world of waking consciousness. It is a world which can be penetrated by the mad, those in love, and the artist, but it is something more than the imagination. The imagination may conjure forms, images of this other world, but this is a world that is entered by, rather than defined by, the imagination. What we can say, what the play shows us, is that we mortals are not what we think we are, and it is this nether invisible world that gives that supposition the lie. St. Augustine famously thanked God that he was not responsible for his dreams, and dreams, like the fairies, are nothing if not irresponsible. The fairies are not quite a lot of other things besides. They are not fair, constant, patient, predictable, pious, or politically correct, and to an extent that was true even in Shakespeare's day. They bear grudges, fight dirty, are imperious, impatient, faithless, and fickle. They are also variously terrifying, beautiful, seductive, amorous, curious, capable, and inventive. And what kind of world would it be were it only made up of the things they are not? Into the wood plunge the pairs of mismatched lovers, and wood in this wood, play on mad, they duly become. Their ruling fantasies about themselves, about their loved ones, are dissolved through the interventions of Oberon and the insouciant errors of Puck, who cannot tell mortals apart. And I like to think this is a kind of mortalist joke on Shakespeare's part. As we witness the right royal quarrel between Oberon and Titania, we observe that in the fairy world, love and hate are consorts. And here, the lovers experience the reality of how love goes hand in glove with hate, a necessary prophylactic if love is going to have any staying power for them. Within the wood's wild freedom, fast friends fight as if to death, former lovers abandon and are abandoned, insults are banded, even rape is threatened. Within the enveloping dream, Hermia, one of the lovers, dreams her own dream of a serpent that ate my heart away, while her lover Lysander sits smiling at his cruel prey. She wakens to the beginnings of the knowledge of good and evil that serpents traditionally bring, to a new reality of a missing Lysander, her lover, who is about to turn against her with a vehemence as fierce as the passionate adoration he has previously shown. The wood is no paradise, but nor is it the forest of Arden, where the only enemies are wind and rough weather. Enemies here are to be found in all quarters. It is, however, real. The problem is, once you get into defining this weird, otherworldly reality, vocabulary becomes wooden and inept. It's that very useful ancient distinction between words and images again. For certain subjects, only the words of a poet work. Shakespeare, with his fairy wood, is conjuring up the ethereal shapes of things unknown. With his usual wit, he has Theseus define this with the typical supercilious contempt of the Athenian upper classes. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination. But what is unknown is not the equivalent of what is unreal. Dreams are the spaces where what we think we know is undone, turned on its head, and we meet the formerly shapeless unknown. Just as in real life, the lovers slip away, the dreams slip away, none of the lovers recall what they were in the wood. But they are, if only marginally, the better for it. Their love, at any rate, is likely to be more enduring for the drubbing it has taken. Only one mortal retains his experience in the wood, and it is relevant that he is both a player and a weaver. I have long had a fantasy that Bottom was played by Shakespeare, or at any rate was his conscious dramatic persona. Bottom is an artist. He wants to play all the parts in the play they are going to put on, as you have to if you're a writer. He shares a quality with the fairies. The fairies are cruel, angry, spiteful, quixotic. But while they can deceive, they are not false. They are fully what they are, and consequently Bottom, who shares this elemental virtue, can see and engage with them. Although it is part of Oberon's contriving malice that Titania falls in love with Bottom, it is also not wholly inappropriate. Setting aside the obvious joking about asses' phalluses, which are part of the sexual fun and games, but also part of the now extremely unfashionable notion in Oberon's mind that what Titania really needs to snap her out of her flowery bower is a good fuck, we see that Shakespeare is rarely one-dimensional. And none of the sexual innuendo means that the choice of bottom for lover of the Queen hasn't also its valid side. In her company, bottom is modest, courteous, and unassuming, however much of a show-off he might appear elsewhere. And he dramatises most delightfully in his role as her lover an intercourse between our waking and our sleeping selves that acknowledges the absurd, the animal, and the ungainly, without shame, fear, or disassociation. Bottom is wise enough, too, to know what should be made of this experience. He's a connoisseur, alive to its worth. I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream, past the wit of man, to say what dream it was. And he knows that what is rare cannot be spoken of or conveyed in plodding prose, but must be preserved in another form of ambiguity. I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream, because it hath no bottom. Now, we may snigger like naughty children at his innocent use of bottom, distracted as we have been by thoughts of monstrous fallacies, and all too ready to endorse Puck's "Lord, what fools these mortals be!" But the laugh is on us. Bottom is right. His author would agree with him. For while dreams may be fundamental, they have no bottom. There is no end to them, or resolution. At the very end of the play, Puck steps out and speaks to the last reality, the audience reality, slyly binding us to these other realities we have been witness to. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. He explicitly relates the play we have seen to a dream or a vision, something so capable of offending in its magic that it has to be dismissed, just as the rude mechanical's play is dismissed by its aristocratic audience, or as the fairies skip away at break of day, as we daily dismiss our dreams. Humankind can bear very little reality, Eliot said, but it can also bear very little of what it prefers to call unreality. The dream world is infinitely disturbing. For one thing, it is a democratic world in which humble labourers get to consort with fairy queens, and betrayal, sexual passion, and murderous aggression are given free rein. Dreams are nightly reminders that we live with pictures of ourselves that are phony, and that to be mortal is never to be quite in control, that we live half our life in the dark among shadows, and there are shades of our own being that will never be quite known to us, and that to know that what we don't know will always be more than what we do may be our only saving option. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely lovely. Any particular questions? The problem is your words are so lovely, we're all thinking, oh, I don't think I can ask anything sensible or intelligent.
Well, ask something unsensible and unintelligent, as in the spirit of my paper.
How much do you think, in terms of your incorporation of your dreams, of your characters' dreams, of your research into the dreams of others, how much of that do you think you take into your books? Does it get better, the interpretation of dreams over time? How much do you go back into the dreams of others and the authors?
I never go back into other people's dreams, and I've only once ever written a dream in my own novels. In
Right.
10 novels, I've got only one dream. Mm-hmm. And I only had that because I wanted to convey to the reader that there was a storm happening. And so I had a dream that, the ones you have in which, in the dream it gets wet. In the dream, she has something thrown over her, but actually there's water leaking through her roof. So I did it entirely for physical reasons of moving the weather along. And I don't put dreams in books because, as I've said, I think it's incredibly difficult to do it. and I'm very interested in it. So I think it could be, I could have done it all on poetry. But I mean, I wanted to start with the Greeks and look at the way they looked at dreams. But it's very, very rare. Wuthering Heights has 2 pretty good dreams. I think that quoted bit in 1984 when Winston Smith dreams that O'Brien says to him, "I will meet you in the place where there is no darkness." That's extremely good and scary. But I think usually they are sort of, as I said, shoved in as a kind of symbolic moment where we go, "Oh yes, so this means that." And I don't think dreams are like that, actually. And I do believe, I have come to believe over the years I worked as an analyst and worked with dreams, which I don't now, that what I said about Anna's dream and the peasant, I mean, I think they're much more ambiguous, actually. So I'm terrifically against, as it were, authoritative dream interpretation.
Yeah.
I think that's extremely dangerous. And, I long for Anna to have had an analyst that said, well, a bit of peasant in you. It was probably quite a...
It's all going to be fine, yeah.
Stick it out, Yes.
Fiction is a world in which anything can happen.
Yes.
And is very dependent on both the author and the reader.
Yes.
Their experience of their own experiences.
Yes.
So there must be actually quite a lot in common between all fiction and dreams. Is that a fair...
Yeah, I think there's this very interesting thing that actually you have actually touched on something I'm very interested in, which is that if, say, I write a book and you read my book, I mean, I'm not saying you have to read my book, but you're there and I'm talking to you. What I put into the book is completed by how you read the book. And actually, a funny thing happens with books. I think classics are books which have been read and read, and that something mysterious happens. So the sort of accumulated meanings that might be nascent or latent, nascent, I think is better, in the book, come out as people read them, and an odd thing happens. So I've had, with my very first novel, it was set in Venice. And first of all, it was always a lovely book about Venice. As time went on, it retells the story of the Book of Tobit through a painting of the book of Tobias and the Angel. As time went on, people got much more interested in the Book of Tobit, so then it became a book, and it's taken many kind of turns, but it's interesting. It sort of happens as though collectively something starts to happen. And I think that's probably true of the dream. So if I'm seeing somebody who brings a dream, there's them dream me. I think the interaction of what I'm going to call our psyches, our 2 psyches, brings out certain elements in the dream. And so a different person than myself might respond differently, and the dream might come to take on a different meaning. So I think that's what you get very, very well in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the sort of amorphous quality that I think operates much more in our life. I'm sure everybody in this room knows this, but it's something that I think it's too difficult to comprehend for us to know really what to do about it, because there isn't anything to be done about it. I think it's the unknowable element that's interesting to me. I like us to have unknowable elements.
And there's something just incredibly plastic about children's dreams, isn't there? I mean, it is just a different state of being.
A different state of being.
At 3, at 6, at 9. I mean, you see it in the clinic, and in fact, their dreams are much, much more mouldable if they scare them than adults are. We see. I mean, it's
yeah. I mean,
thing in the world.
I thought that. I imagined
ending.
that peasant being dreamt by a child, and it's much more like a figure in a fairy story.
Yeah.
Where you could see it going in a different direction. And I think Tolstoy intimates this. I mean, he doesn't spell it out. I mean, I spelled it out, but when you see her falling to her death, she has this moment of vision, of joy and brightness. So it's as though the thing has exploded, and it's too late. She's taken the wrong interpretation, which is, it's brave of him to do that, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.